When I was teaching more within the midwifery school, I mentioned like we would have workshops for practicing midwives, not just women who wanted to become midwives, who wanted a different perspective. And we would like go through the spiel and talk about, well, like what do you do? Well, you're, holding the space, you're the smell membrane, you're the shaman. And they'd be like, well, what do I do then? I'm like, well, you don't really do anything. But that's the most powerful role, don't you see? Like,
That's the better.
they're like, no, like, what do I do? Like, I have all these tools and these skills and these things. I'm like, well, you might need them, but your work is to learn how you need them and when, and not just like you do them because that's what you're told is the way to do it to be most safe, because it's not. It's not. You have to return to this aspect of what birth is about being a human, that there is an element of unknown, of magic, like of still, even if you didn't believe in magic, of all kinds of science that we have no idea or don't understand at all yet at this point in time. Like I had a moment where it hit me where it's like, there is no way I could ever know more about a woman or a family's birth than they know. There's absolutely impossible. Like, and it's my job to learn how to follow their energy, to know when they may need a skill that I have, but I can't know more, and I can't come into this thinking that I know more.
Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca, co-host, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson, and writer teacher Jessica. We are online at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find that link to our site in the episode notes. You can also find our personal social media handles as at Don Eduardo Barca on Instagram and just his Twitter handle as at jhomie89. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. Thank you. Well, today we'll be in conversation with Jaydee and Jay, former interviewees, folks that we've had on What's Left when we've interviewed them for the Appalachian Academy of Therapeutic Arts. A different type of education, very alternative. Even that does not describe. And what we interviewed them about, and we hope that folks will be able to look at that past episode that we did with them. Today we'll be in conversation about midwifery. The topic will be about midwifery, but we'll see where it takes us on this ride, because these two individuals have a lot of knowledge to share with us and impart. So just as a reminder for folks that have just tuned in with us, who haven't heard past episodes, Jaydee has worked in the realms of education and empowerment and therapeutic transformation. She is a home birth midwifery practitioner and a mother to 5 bio children and 1 stepchild, and 4 of those children were born at home with midwives. And she is one of the founding roles at AATA, and it's been a lifelong dream for them. And I'm very excited that we'll be getting to have her again share with us of the update from the school. And Jay, who's been working with trauma both as a facilitator and educator for over 25 years, and in 2006 he studied vibrational medicine with Fabian Mammon at the Tamadu Institute, focusing on resolving dissonances in the physical and subtle bodies. And Jay has been a professional musician and music instructor since 2002, creating accessibility to all levels of music capabilities, helping everyone he works with to access their innate harmonic genius. Thank you both for joining us again today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. It's great to be here again.
How have you, first, I guess I just want to start off by asking, how have you both been since we've last spoken?
Well, it's always like a wild ride over here in these mountains, for sure. But
we just finished our second year of AATA. So today was the day, the final day. So that's been a pretty big milestone. And, aside from being very, enmeshed and absorbed in that, it's also been a pretty big triumph for the level of cohesiveness and stability that we've reached in year 2. So there's a really great team of folks have come together, and we're really glad to be finished with our second year and looking forward to our third year. Mm-hmm. So it's really exciting.
Yeah. Feels like we've gotten a lot of the foundational pieces more in place and solid, and an opportunity to play a little bit more, to look at building and enriching the curriculum from the therapeutic aspects that we've really wanted to be able to have more time to do since the beginning. So that is bringing a lot more joy for me in particular. And we had an opportunity in February to attend the Next Steps conference in Georgia and present on the school. So sharing from that perspective as offering a model for what other people might be able to incorporate into their community, whatever types of educational opportunities people might want to provide that are similar to us, like just really stepping into a role of now mentoring other folks, which I love. So that's just, another cool thing that's happened since we talked last.
Beautiful.
Speaking to midwifery and the process of birth, the way that we've been framing this in our conversations is that what we're doing with the school and the children that we're working with, which roughly go from around 3 to about 12 at this point, this is just part of the process that we find ourselves in, because we go from coming from whatever kind of family situation we came from, reaching whatever type of life position we reach if we choose to have children, and then we find ourselves faced with a situation of tremendous significance and potency and transformation and weight and significance in this lineage type way. Like an intergenerational thing is happening when we start to engage with the process of having a child. And so in that way, what we're doing with AATA is really just part of a continuum that has been a really central piece of what has brought Jaydee and I together in our on our paths together in this life. And so her background with working as a home birth midwife and really the transformational quality of what birth is and all of those things. I mean, it's essentially you're opening up a portal to bring a life into another dimension. And so there's all of these metaphysical or subtle spiritual significances to this. And so the way that I look at it is that we have this like I said before, there's this intergenerational quality to what goes on with reproduction and where we find ourselves. We're just one piece along the spectrum. And so we do carry with us, and we have to contend with, as men and women that are having children and part of that continuum, we have to contend with all of these, for lack of a better word, challenging and or nefarious aspects that are creating a situation where the birthing landscape that we find ourselves trying to navigate is fractured and broken and actually working against us in a lot of ways to be in our true and empowered experience of what that means to be a father or a mother, or even a birthing child, being a child being birthed, or a young child, or a grandparent, anywhere along that spectrum. And so we find ourselves in a situation where oftentimes from the point of conception, we end up with these missteps, or an unplanned pregnancy, or an unwanted pregnancy, or a lot of mixed feelings around, one parent maybe feeling one way about it, another parent feeling one way about it, and that extending out through the family. So we have these different ideas, taboos, expectations, social norms, all of these things working. And then that, carries on through into our gestational period, where we contend with different caretakers that are telling us we don't know what we're doing, we need to do XYZ, rather than facilitating or holding space for us to tap into something on an internal level where we're following our own compass. And so there is an interesting aspect to how, in our situation, like the father and the mother can both be equally represented and supported to follow the intuitive aspects of each of those and how they can work together. And so that isn't something that is really being held by mainstream medical or mainstream much of anything for that matter. And so that goes on through the gestational period, where there's the mother is carrying the child and the father is there along for the ride, but really the direction of how that's being dictated is coming from caretakers, which are outside of that family unit. And so then that leads up to the birth itself, and then we have this incredibly powerful transformational portal experience. And thinking about the idea of a portal and how that's how that comes into play as far as what's going on. But even with the terminology of the idea of like the birth canal, right? So that brings in this maritime admiralty language where it's, again, we're in indentured servitude or slavery kind of mentality as far as our thoughts around this. And then from the birthing experience, you have this incredible altered state transformative situation going on that's being highly managed by the medical machine. And so even outside of that, even in a lot of midwifery, it still happens. It's still someone that knows and the birthing parents that don't know. And so it's really kind of shocking and surprising how often that type of thing still goes on, even within these more alternative ways of doing things, or working with doulas and midwives and things like that. And so then, from that point on, the child is already in a place of separation from themselves, from the parents. And so it creates this situation where it snowballs, and then you end up with children in daycare, children in the public school system, growing up in a situation where we're being further programmed to not be following our inner compass, looking outside of ourselves for direction, and so on and so forth. And so that kind of speaks to this intergenerational quality that I'm seeing and how this plays out. And so to tie that in with AATA and birth, so that's that's my 2 cents on that. So
well, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I'm still trying to digest that myself. I think what you're saying is the very things we were told, if you don't know what you're doing in terms of educating your child, or the child, you don't know what you're doing while being educated, that process of being told you don't know what you're doing starts from jump, basically, and somebody else gets involved in it and directs the whole thing. That's what I'm hearing you talk about in terms of, and drawing a connection between a system that's telling you that and how to free yourself from that, starting from reproduction. If I'm understanding it right.
Yeah, I mean, I think
it's full cycle,
a full circle of things. And I mean, there's lots of different really amazing people who've spent a lot of time researching and studying and looking at birth practices and the history of birth and the current state of birth in modern societies. And if you agree to a more basic idea of evolution, which I'm not quite sure I do, or I don't know where anybody's at, but for a landing place, at one point in time, humans were more at the mercy of nature. Like, we were responding to nature. And then, from the evolutionary standpoint perspective, at some point that shifted, and we realized, or we began, or however that looked, to be able to manipulate nature rather than just being in a response. And so then we could manipulate nature, right? The founding of agriculture, all those things, manipulate other humans, because now we see that we have power over rather than just power upon us. And at that point in time, it's, history, what we have of history that's written down and our perceptions of it is that birth practices were interfered with from that point. And one may ask why, and then there's lots of examples of how birth practices have been interfered with for hundreds of years, whether it's saying colostrum is terrible and a baby has to be kept away from the mom for the first 3 days, or cutting a cord, or any number of, umbilical cord, any number of these things. And the thought at that point in time would be, well, we're trying to create a human that is more aggressive, essentially, that feels like life is hard. Like we're going to interfere at that point in time, initially upon, being here for the first moments of life, that life is hard and it's not easy, and we're going to do these things. And so that's still going on, obviously. So if you look at our current situation around birth, birth is still the most focused upon moments of one's life in a medical field where birth doesn't have anything to do with medicine. Truly, it's a very opposed processes. Medicine is there to interfere when the body cannot do what it's supposed to do. Birth is physiologic. It has a plan. It unfolds. It works, or else humans wouldn't be here. But for some reason, it's still highly focused on, and it's highly manipulated. And so for me, I'm like, that's not a coincidence. Somehow, some beings, some forces still know that that's a very potent time. There's someone by the name of Michelle O'Donnell who has a whole institute called the Primal Health Research Institute. And he's been incorporating hundreds, if not thousands, of studies to create a database where we can all look at what's going on with birth, from a very meta-analytical standpoint. And he has termed the primal health period is through gestation, birth, and the first year of life. And is saying the things that are done during that period have an exponential effect on the future of whatever, a mammal, a human. So if you're wanting to create a change in genetics or behavior, or, our immune system or endocrine system, do it during that primal health time, and you will see an effect within 1, 2, 3 generations versus, 10, 20 years type of thing. And so again, it's like, why do we care? Birth doesn't make a lot of money. Birth it's not something that needs to be, like I mentioned, in a medical system. So it goes to this place of well, what, why are we still doing this? What do we see the need, or what is, gained from interfering with the birth process? And then there's a lot of questions around that are interesting to talk about, for sure. Both of us can keep talking. I'll pause for you to have questions. Yeah.
Well, Jaydee, do you want to go into your kind of personal story at all? Either in terms of becoming a mother, your own births, and or your journey, toward midwifery. Yeah. And maybe with that second one at some point, I would love to maybe just touch on the question of even just that word of midwife or midwifery and how you define it. I think it's in the sort of mainstream culture, I think the word doesn't mean anything like what it meant 300 years ago. So I'm always kind of curious to when people are throwing around that word, and that's how we're even framing this whole episode. I think maybe just a sort of definitional inquiry might be generative.
Sure. As far as a bit on my story or my history, I had always felt like I wanted to be an obstetrician. I had a full scholarship pre-med, started that track 100%, and then attended a hospital birth. It floored me. I thought that the baby actually died. I left the room, was trying to process what it would be like to be with a mother and a dead baby. And come to find out, the baby was completely fine, that everything I had witnessed was normal in the hospital situation. And it just sent me, spinning and spiraling into well, what is this? What's happening? This isn't how I want to be. This isn't what I thought this was about. And so I pulled back from that and took some time, thought I might be a nurse, still didn't really fit. So yeah, just continued to hold space for that, and ended up working with someone whose roommate was studying to be a midwife. And I was like, oh, what is this? Tell me more about this other option here. And at that point, I had a very distinct memory of my mom's friend when I was probably about maybe 9 on my back porch. And she was just for simplicity's sake, she was a lovely hippie of the 80s, and she had hair growing in parts that I didn't think women ever let hair grow in. And I was remembering this memory of my mom's friend telling me about how she had her baby in her front yard, on her front porch, on 9 Mile in Detroit. And if anybody has any, knowing of what that's like, it's like, oh my God, how would somebody have a baby in their front yard in the middle of Detroit? But that's what she wanted to do. And it was an amazing birth, and it was like perfect for her. And then, so reconciling that memory with where I was at that point, I completely dropped out of college and started traveling the country in search of a midwifery education, and spent time doing short internships around with different midwives throughout many different states. Landed back in Michigan shortly after that, found out I was pregnant with my first son. Went into that pregnancy and labor feeling relatively confident because I had been I planned a home birth, studying home birth midwifery at that point for like 3 or 4 years. And the birth itself, I can say all of my births would be successful home births. There were no complications. There was nothing untoward that you could see from the outside. First time mom, 7-hour labor at home. That's pretty phenomenal, actually. But I walked away from it feeling like something wasn't right, and I didn't quite know what it was. I became pregnant with my second son sooner than I had anticipated. So my first was only 9 months old, and went into that pregnancy feeling actually quite depressed. Again, not really knowing, like a lot of like unresolved things that I didn't have the resources to really do much with at the time. Went on to have a second home birth that was only like 3 hours long. Again, everything was lovely from the outside, but left it feeling like in a really intense state emotionally, and that I couldn't do midwifery anymore. And so I took a different path into nutrition and just kind of set it aside. But for a lot of people I know who are interested in birth, it doesn't necessarily ever leave your heart and your soul. So as time went on, I found myself helping some young women in my community, like with, doing doula work, stuff like that. And then feeling like inspired again, and deciding at the time, and this was in like 2002, I guess, that I was going to go to Seattle Midwifery School, which at that point in time was one of the only midwifery schools that existed in our country. So I moved my young family to Seattle and was just like, I'm just going to do this. I want to get it done. At that point, I've been studying for long enough, and I'm like, this is my life. This is what I want to do. Shortly after moving to Seattle, I found out I was pregnant unexpectedly with my third son, who was due at the same time Seattle Midwifery School would have began. I then chose to have my third son and not attend the midwifery school. But during that pregnancy, I moved into a community house with a woman who was due almost the same exact time as me, and she was having an unassisted birth. And I was kind of like, what in the world is better than a home birth midwife? Assisted birth, like what's unassisted birth? And again, this was over 10 years ago. There wasn't anything other than a book by Laura Shanley called Unassisted Birth, really, for a reference point. Now there's many things that you can find in regards to a more free birth. And through the summer when I lived with that woman, like my world was turned upside down. She went on to tell me about how she'd had her first child with a midwife, how she came away really traumatized. And it allowed me to see what I had been missing from my first 2 experiences. And it was that even though I was at home with lovely home birth midwives, I was still very much manipulated and controlled. But it was almost worse, because it was from this place of like insidious control where you think you aren't controlled, right? Because you have this woman whose whole life is dedicated to allowing women to have like empowered births. However, if you aren't addressing what happens between humans, in intense situations, and how we don't control other humans, and all these psychological things that don't necessarily fit inside of any particular category, we still as humans often find it necessary to control, especially in a situation that feels fearful or feels like we don't know what the outcome is. And so during that pregnancy, I really was able to move through my first 2 births and heal and figure that out, and went on to have not like a proper, I guess, again, like defining some of these things might be really helpful, unassisted birth with my 3rd child. And it was everything that I felt like I had missed in the first 2. So at that point, it completely redirected where I was going with midwifery. And I was like, well, I want to help women have unassisted births. Like, how do you do this? What does this mean as a birth worker? And within a few months after that, just through mutual friends, I found a particular school called the Matrona. And when I went to a workshop that was being put on by that school, in the workshop, the woman who was teaching it, the woman who founded the program, she said, well, really, the only reason I think people are at births is to write it down in the Akashic records. And I was like, what? Like, what's that? Like, that's more pointing to what I'm looking for, or what I felt in my 3rd birth. And it became the witness, the space holder, which again, like, that translates to the shaman, to the ayahuasquero, to the person that really doesn't do anything but holds everything, right? And they know when to support, but they aren't just supporting because their role is to support. They're there as like the cell membrane. And so then I went on to study with this midwifery school, to then become a part of the teaching staff, to then become an administrator, all these things. I spent the next probably close to 10 years as a part of like that organization in particular, and working to create another picture of what birth support could look like. Then I had a couple more kids that were also home births, and maybe the last one is the baby that we had together, which was a pretty awesome birth. Depending on time, we could talk about that a little bit more. But in particular, then I was still on the West Coast for the majority of the time I was just referring to. And then the woman who founded the school actually initially had began it in Asheville many years prior. And she was like, I'm moving back to Asheville. I want to keep this going. You want to come with me and you can still have a job? And I was like, great. So we moved to Asheville. The climate, I mentioned earlier that in North Carolina, home birth midwives are illegal unless you're a nurse midwife, which I'm not. And I've never been a licensed midwife or a certified midwife. There's lots of different political, definitions per state, per country, as far as what's legal, what's not. In Washington state, I would have also been an illegal midwife. I'm an illegal midwife here. So upon moving here, part of an agreement that I had with the school was to actually not practice, because you can teach whatever you want, and that's not illegal, but to practice would be, and that could like potentially cause challenge for the school. So in moving here, I was teaching, and then started to do a lot more with perinatal mental health, trauma work, did lactation, childbirth classes, things like that, which was where I was really like spending most of my time when we connected. And then that continued to like roll into the school that we have now.
So Jaydee, when you say it's illegal, from the sense that if you are like physically, or even if you're present at a birth, that's considered like, be it basically like practicing medicine without a license type of a thing? Or because some people define a midwife now as like,
and it's all very licensed. Yeah, it's all very much based on the culture of each community. And this is constantly changing within communities, within states, as laws, evolve over time. When I moved here, there had been some midwives who were practicing for a number of years, and they felt confident enough to have, some advertising in town, things like that. However, about 4 months after I was living here, there actually was a baby who passed away under the care of a home birth midwife. And it was one of like a nationally known case where this midwife actually spent in total over 36 months either on house arrest or actually in jail without any charges at all. And at the point in time when she was released, the details were a new district attorney actually came in and looked at the placenta pathology, which had been there the entire time, which stated that this midwife had nothing to do with the baby's death, and let her out. So there's still, if you want to say witch hunts people in jail, this is happening all over our country. This even with licensed midwives, because then you get into like, well, are you still practicing under the, the umbrella of what your license dictates? And ultimately you are still under the medical model's care, a doctor's care. The doctors are determining whether you're safe as a midwife, whether you're technically illegal, or an illegal would be, in North Carolina, for example, a more direct and like a direct entry midwife used to be a term for that. Like, and they used to actually say DEM, or a lay midwife, or I don't know. I mean, there's a variety of terms that continue to change. I mean, a lot of people don't use the word midwife anymore because the term midwife has become more of a medical term due to licensing and nurse midwifery, which is very much, a very big gap from where true midwifery was, 100 years ago, or 50 years ago even. So as far as like the illegal place in particular, it's very subjective. And in relation to that case that I just mentioned, it wasn't the family, the parents who were even upset or did anything legally against that midwife. It was actually the grandparents who then interacted with the state, and the state then prosecuted the midwife. And regardless of the parents or any parent saying, please don't do anything to my midwife, we completely agreed to this, we did whatever, it wouldn't matter because the state would step in. She was charged with murder because this baby had died. And there are plenty now, actually, like at that point in Asheville, midwives definitely, went back under a little bit more. And over the last 5 or so years, more people have come back out locally in our area. And there are people who are practicing. And at any point, as far as being safe in doing so, regardless, I mean, the idea in the past has always been if you don't get paid and you're there, then you could always say you were a friend, or, whatever you could tell yourself. But if you're receiving any money, then you could be doing this thing that's potentially practicing medicine without a license. And so then that gets into what a lot of people will like, I'm not doing it for money, but the amount of responsibility that you hold as a midwife to not take and receive appropriate compensation is also a really big issue for our culture at large. Like, a midwife is holding a family's life and death on call for 2 to 3 months during the birthing time, and then throughout a pregnancy and into the postpartum. I mean, no doctor even does that. And so to say I'm not doing it without pay, or you're going to do it for trade, or we're going to find some other way, I mean, that also is just undermining what is happening. And then it gets into, well, like, can midwives, where I've mentioned a little bit before, like, where is the midwife's capacity to actually hold space from the place of what maybe a birthing family truly needs to have this transformative experience of bringing in a life versus interfering or not. And yeah. How else can I help answer that question?
Well, man, there's so many questions that come up for me. I guess, Jessica, you asked initially that also if Jaydee could say, what do you mean by midwifery? Maybe what I hear, though, in your response is when you talk about the unassistedness in it and being more a witness, taking that approach. If there's more, is there more you want to say about? Because honestly, this is really new to me. I don't even know how the standard medical process goes. I was born, obviously, but I haven't had a kid, and Brandy and I don't intend to. And I mean, if we didn't have ever heard of this, we would have gone down that normal road of ultrasonograms and seeing a doctor and, whatever goes on there. But then there are these terms like doula and midwife, and then a nurse midwife versus a regular midwife. And then so maybe, I don't know if that might be helpful for me, if you could walk me through some of those gradations to where you are at, basically.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So a doula is a relatively new term in the last 10 to 20 years, and it's someone who offers technically just emotional physical, in a sense of like supporting with different birthing positions, or I can, massage you or put a hot washcloth on some part of your body, but it's more of this like supportive role that's not bringing in any type of assessments or diagnoses or interpretations of like the actual birth and gestational process. So that also, a lot of these things can get very gray, and the regulations that are putting on these things are all also very new. So because doulas happened, there needed to be a regulating body for doulas. So a bunch of people who felt like they had enough criteria to be a regulating body created a regulating body to regulate doulas nationally, but national doula regulation isn't required, it isn't necessary. Then there's, state doula accreditation programs, and all of this is just happening, organically. Like I could become I can certify doulas because I say I can, type of thing. But then that becomes, well, what does a doula actually do or not in these places of like the national certification, for example? You can't massage now or use herbs because now there's certifications for massage and certifications for herbology. And if you cross them, then you would be practicing some other, modality that you aren't able, or whatever, qualified to do. So then you bring in the midwifery piece, and that would be somebody who would take on more of those medical type aspects or diagnoses or assessments during the birth and gestation postpartum period. So, I can say very specific examples to help with that, whereas like a midwife would be listening to a baby's heartbeat, like during pregnancy and during birth, which is referred to as fetal heart tones, and giving a mother or a family their interpretation and recommendation around like the health of their baby based on the fetal heart tones. That's actually one of the number one ways that they determine baby's health, is by listening to a baby's heart during the time period of gestation and birth. A doula technically should not be listening to fetal heart tones and giving the family an interpretation of what they feel like those heart tones mean. But then, anybody can listen to a heartbeat, right? Like you can buy the equipment on Amazon and you can look up what fetal heart tones mean. And so it can get really gray, and none of that necessarily matters, right? Until you bring in a legal system that might want to say you're doing something you're not, again, qualified to do. So then, yes, the midwife would potentially hold more of these other types of assessment processes around a woman during her pregnancy and birth and postpartum period that can be quite similar in maybe more traditional medical ways. Now, well, then I can say, so each state, there's a national certification for midwives. So you can become a certified professional midwife, which is nationally. Then each state can choose if they want to recognize that certification or not. So in North Carolina, they don't recognize that certification. They don't recognize anything. So anybody who's not a nurse midwife, which is somebody who has become a registered nurse and then basically taking a master's program in midwifery, if you're not that, then you can't practice what we call midwifery in our state. In Colorado, they have registered midwives, and that's how the state accepts CPMs. In Washington, they have licensed midwives. So it really depends on where you're at. And then also, again, how the community enforces what's really happening within the different midwifery options that someone may choose. Let me see. And then the medical model of birth, where a nurse midwife here can practice at home if they want. So you can have a home birth in North Carolina with a nurse midwife. They do have to be overseen by a doctor, which again makes it very difficult also to operate outside of the medical model, because the doctor still has to answer to who they're licensed with, which would be the medical board. And the medical board has a very different perspective on how birth should unfold than this other opposite end of midwifery. So then all of it can get really co-opted and messed up. And to me, that was a big part of, well, how nurse midwives, or even licensed midwives now, because then they're following still this medical model to get recognition to become licensed or certified, how much they're interfering with the process versus being able to hold space, because the medical model is a proactive model. You're looking for the problem to solve it before it happens. But birth isn't, there's no problem in birth, unless there is. So it's it's very contradictory, where we create a scenario then where we're see it as a problem when really it's not. And that has become a huge disease of what we see pregnancy and childbirth to even be, when there is no pathology present, unless, in the rare circumstances there are, and then we can do something about it. But it's been Yeah, really taken over, I guess you could say. How else can I clarify or help with that?
Well, and there's the whole other aspect of the birth centers too.
Yeah, and birth
Which is
centers, which is another, which in so many ways are a blessing. And I know plenty of people who've had babies at birth centers, and usually it's just like in our state, only nurse midwives can work at birth centers. In Washington state, licensed midwives or nurse midwives can work at birth centers. But what I have seen over the years, more often than not, unless you are like homeless, which some women are, and want to have a baby at a birth center rather than a hospital, or if you have like a very specific set of circumstances where your home is just totally not suitable for birth, what often I'm seeing is women who really want a home birth. Like when you read their birth plan and what they want at a birth center is they want a birth that's autonomous, where they can, you know, have themselves be the dictator of the process, but then they're putting themselves in a birth center most of the time because they're not, they still have fear around the process. So it's like the birth center is a little bit safer than my house, but it's not quite the hospital yet. But birth centers are almost always governed by the local hospital or some type of medical institution or medical system of like checks and balances. And so it's some people have termed it like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Like you're going there thinking you're getting a certain thing, but really you're getting the medical model hidden. Like it would be better just to go to the hospital because you know what you're going to get. And so then you can be more prepared for it, to interface with it.
Just to go back, I just want to kind of like highlight the licensing and certification aspect of this that keeps coming up because, and you probably know way more about kind of the history, Jaydee, of midwifery and sort of like how the male doctor, right, kind of entering and pushing out traditional midwives who basically were doing, umbrella term, like they, like you said, like there was no such thing as a doula, like they were doing herbs, they were doing probably massage and whatever, right? They were like wise women, right, a lot of the time, who were extremely experienced and kind of chosen by that community in a lot of cases. And then so you had the male doctor kind of coming in, pushing them out, and then over time, right, the licensing laws were a huge part of the way that they were able to sort of fold those sort of community members into the medical model, right? And like suddenly, oh, you have to have this piece of paper, right, which is issued by, the state, or issued, and we go back a couple centuries, the church was huge as well. But I just think it's like it's not like this isn't a new thing. It sounds so complicated, and you got to have a state license in this way, and sometimes it's recognized, sometimes it's not, and it's like, yeah, I mean, of course, all of our legislation just across the board is super messy, but it's really quite, I don't know what the right word is, like just insidious. Like if you look back and see that the very, very purposeful way that licensure and certification was used as a way to just really just like kind of drive that like final blow to traditional midwifery in terms of status and like capability to actually do that work, at least to do it out in the open. And yeah, I'm thinking too, like this with this conversation, like a word that gets used a lot in kind of like alternative birth communities and stuff is like midwife, right? Of like this idea that, okay, a midwife, like usually referring to a licensed midwife, is really like, it's not really a traditional midwife in like the original sense of the word at all, because you're reporting to a doctor. Ultimately, you're loyal to
and
you're working for. You're loyal to the state.
You are,
or you're liable, right?
Yes,
And
you're not liable. You've invested at that point tens of thousands of dollars to gain this recognition, to gain the license, the certification, and you're put in that rock in the hard place of like, well, am I doing good? Is it better than doing nothing? Like, or at least I'm offering something at home versus that. But right now I know I need to, for example, I'll go back to the heart tones. Like now, like because of my license, it says I have to take heart tones every 15 minutes at this stage in labor, but You know, I know instinctually and intuitively about birth from this other place of like wise, energetic woman's work, that if I go in and try to take heart tones at this moment, it's going to interrupt something. It's going to interrupt the limbic process of how all of this birth, you know, is unfolding. But I have to go take heart tones right now, because if my chart gets pulled and I haven't done it every 15 minutes at this stage in labor, I could lose my license. So you get into, I mean, I never became licensed or certified because I felt like watching this, and I don't know if I'm right, you know, like I'm still, it's up for negotiation, but like watching this time and time again, I felt like I would be a less of a midwife if I was licensed, because I would have to follow these things, and that would be who I was serving versus serving the family or the mother. And I would bring in this contradiction all over the place. But again, that's just me. There are plenty of midwives that I honor and respect, and that's their path, and they feel like it's working for them. But I do think it's really important stuff to be talking about. When I was teaching more within the midwifery school, I mentioned like we would have workshops for practicing midwives, not just women who wanted to become midwives, who wanted a different perspective. And we would like go through the spiel and talk about, well, like, what do you do? Well, you're, you know, holding the space, you're the smell membrane, you're the shaman. And they'd be like, well, what do I do then? I'm like, well, you don't really do anything, but that's the most powerful role, don't you see? Like,
That's the better.
you're like, no, you know, like, what do I do? Like, I have all these tools and these skills and these things. I'm like, well, you might need them, but your work is to learn how you need them and when, and not just like you do them because that's what you're told is the way to do it to be most safe, because it's not. It's not. You have to return to this aspect of what birth is about being a human, that there is an element of unknown, of magic, like of still, even if you didn't believe in magic, of all kinds of science that we have no idea or don't understand at all yet at this point in time. And so giving space for that. And at one point in my midwifery, when I was in that school learning to be a midwife very early on, like I had a moment where it hit me where it's like, there is no way I could ever know more about a woman or a family's birth than they know. There's absolutely impossible. Like, and it's my job to learn how to follow their energy, to know when they may need a skill that I have, but I can't know more, and I can't come into this thinking that I know more. And that's like one of the key differences, right? In all of this and in all the training, and how a birth, you know, a birth facilitator allows themselves to be at that birth, or even during the pregnancy, not just the birth, the pregnancy too.
I want to check if Eduardo, do you have any questions or things you want to ask about this? Because I do have questions. If you don't,
go ahead. You can. I want to continue with this line of thought. Yeah.
Okay. Well, first off, again, this is fascinating to listen to.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's, for me, it's unfolding like what you're talking about. Because I think, Jay, you said this, you gave this long spiel about midwifery that was a little, I think I got it, but then I was like confusing. But it has been necessary to be part of this conversation for me to begin to understand what you're describing as this shaman person. I guess the question that would come for me is, can we walk it back then? And I'm not asking this as a diagnostic, like how would I find, but really to help me understand the process. So a woman gets pregnant, whether they have a husband or a wife or whether they have a partner or not. What would they do to explore this unassisted place, this shaman place? How might they know? Because what does the other system say? Here's my doctorate. I got my credentials. I got this. That's the doctor. Okay. Then there's the midwife who's licensed. Here's my Yelp page, and here's all the people. Here's my license that tells me I'm. But that's just ways of the state coming in and controlling the process and saying it's ours, not yours. So if you wanted to stay out of that, what does that woman do? How does she proceed in this kind of world to find a shaman? When you even said that shaman, how do I know I'm even? It becomes. I'm not saying it's a position of doubting, but could you walk me through how does one then proceed? Then maybe the person says, I don't need anyone. Like I'm just going to have my kid, and I'm going to have my kid in my room, and it could be that, right? Or help me understand how a person in a free world would
Mm-hmm.
How would this process unfold?
Well, there's an aspect to life, right, that we live in where we look to altered states to help us answer questions such as those, right, as humans. Like we look to a state of different consciousness than our waking reality to help us answer big questions about our life, esoteric questions, et cetera, et cetera. Altered states can look like many things. They can look like sleep, right? In our dreams. They can look like praying. They can look like going for a walk in the woods. They could look like playing golf, right? But we all do this. It's a very important part of being a human in relation to how we walk through life. And, and we like to think that in more ancient times, there was more of this. There was more spirituality that was like throughout cultures rather than religion in the way that we see it now as a tool or an access point to like help us answer questions like this. But it's still there. And when you look at the experience and the state of a woman when she's pregnant, it's a very altered state of consciousness. The increase, the change in endocrine hormones and neurohormones, in your cardiology, like everything changes and adjusts, and you become, if you can even blend science with spirituality, this is the time. Like this is the place where even the people who are the most scientific among us don't know what's going on. We've at this point in time, we've probably all heard of DMT, and DMT is actually a natural occurring thing in our bodies. It's naturally occurring in plants. It's all over the place. But right currently, at this state in time in our like evolution, I guess again you could say, in humans, when DMT is released in our brains, it's immediately reabsorbed. There's another chemical that gets released that takes it out essentially of our brain. So it's like it's there, but we can't have it. And one might think that that's because maybe we're not mature enough to have that yet. Or what would it look like if we're walking around in life in a free flow DMT state? It would look very different than it looks right now, right? However, there's a lot of research on when is DMT released and it's allowed to stay longer. And this is like the near-death experience. Some people may have this during, intense meditative states or other types of, spiritual practice or cultivation of the altered state where DMT may be allowed to stay longer. And that's where somebody comes back and they're like, whoa, guess what just happened to me, right? And it's life-changing. You have those moments. We all do. It's actually also released during pregnancy more, and then during birth in the birthing mother, and during birth in the baby. And looking at this as, it's been termed the spirit molecule, like it is an access point between this realm of existence and another realm of existence. It's the time when the portals open, like Jay was saying, for a baby to come in. And the DMT is the vehicle for that. So to answer your question, it's not necessarily straightforward. It's not necessarily simple in some ways. And then in others, it can be very practical because right now we have media like we've never had it before. We have podcasts. There's some incredible podcasts that exist all around free birth, unassisted birth. Jessica mentioned one at this point. There's a handful of them that you can just start getting information. You can start unraveling what's inside of yourself to feel like, to see what feels right. You can meet other women. You can talk with them. There's so many the abundance of social media that allows communication around like, what was your birth like? What was my birth like? That actually is creating this sense of community that we didn't have even, 50, 100 years ago when the Industrial Revolution took over and really shifted the course of birth. So the process of when someone finds themselves pregnant and they want to know what to do, the first thing that I would say is start your spiritual practice. What does that mean to you? If it means swimming at the Y, great, do it more. Start journaling, start looking within to unravel your, whatever trauma you might have, because we all have it. It's a part of life. Start looking and asking about your own birth, the births of you, your mother's birth, the births within your family, because those things travel through us. And start asking people, what their births were like. If you have no context of what you might want, just start seeing what's around you and what's available and then running it through your own compass every day. Like, does that feel right? Does that not feel right? Do I want to read another book? Do I want to ask another question? And from there, looking into your community as far as what the climate, again, asking other mothers, asking people, what's the climate like here for birth? What's the hospital like? Are there midwives? Just beginning to really ask those questions and, finding your way through that process. It's definitely isn't, I mean, at least for me, obviously, it's not something that I would say should be done without thought, right? But it can be. And for the majority of people in the modernized world, it is done with very little thought, right? You are pregnant, you go to the obstetrician, they tell you what to do. They most likely tell you when you have to have your baby. They will force your baby to come out of you if you don't have your baby during the time they say you should have your baby. And then you go home and you figure out how to be a parent on your own.
Well, there's a prescribed track that's available.
Yes.
If you don't actively seek out, and honestly, it seems to be both it's such a personal journey for every family, for every mother, and there's, like you were saying earlier, you can't begin to know more about that woman or that baby's journey or that family's journey than they do. And so, to just be mindful of this. We don't want to automatically just assume that we know that the alternative route is best for everybody.
Right.
I mean, it's so dependent on where somebody's at, and to try and thrust this idea of we have to do it outside the system for this other person is just the same thing happening from a different angle, and so it is really, because we have spent, Jaydee and I have spent time together as a couple consulting and counseling other couples, and it's just such an independent process for each person and what they need, what they're ready to receive in whatever direction. And so, all one can do is just be there and, hold that space. And so, yeah, that's my.
I think it's it's such a hard question too, because like you said, Andy, like in a free world, but like in the world that we're in, I mean, we live in a society where like we don't trust mothers, we don't trust women, we don't trust birth.
We don't trust ourselves.
We don't trust ourselves. And even like, and you may not like experience that like fear mongering or whatever, especially in this lane, but like you know about it in all these other tracks. And it's like, when I heard that question, I'm like, well, of course I may change my mind, but like I can't wait to give birth and I know exactly what I want to do. But then I think about, okay, well, I've met doulas, I've met midwives, I've heard all sorts of birth stories. I'm in the free birth society, and I just have been exposed to a really wide spectrum of birth stories. If I'd gotten pregnant at like 21, I wouldn't have had a fucking clue. I just would have been ushered right through the system, just like everybody else, right? Which maybe would have been great, or maybe would have been extremely traumatic, or something in between. But it's like when you're not given those other options, when you don't, even just simple things like I didn't even know like my birth story. Like I never really had like sat down and asked my mom, like, I hear little bits and pieces and stuff, but I like not until I was like 30 plus years old had I asked that question. Like we're so dissociated from our own like lineage and our, just think about the women in your life. Like it's still taboo to talk about like breastfeeding and periods and stuff, like let alone, the actual physiological, let alone the spiritual dimensions of birth. So I don't know. I think it should be an easy answer to that question of like, do whatever the fuck you want. Like the woman should get to decide what to birth however the fuck she wants to birth. But it's not at all that easy, because we're just so fear-mongered. And if you even just like express the tiniest interest in something alternative in this realm, in a lot of cases, like you will be met with extreme fear-mongering threats, you know, like going back to the grandparents that like call the state on their own family. I mean, that's unfortunately, I don't think that far removed from a common mentality.
And then, I mean, the places that I like to talk about a lot too, I think we mentioned this earlier, is like, why? You know, why is that the state of birth? And it's because it is the most powerful thing that we do other than die, right? And those two things actually, right, like in our current culture, are very hidden away behind the doors, and they're not common, and we can't talk about them. And again, why?
They're very highly managed.
They're very highly managed, for sure. And it's like when you get into like some of the things again, where I'm a newly pregnant mom and I'm starting to ask in my community, and maybe I'm showing some interest in alternative options, and somebody says, oh, well, that's so dangerous. And don't you want a safe and healthy birth? Don't you want your baby to live? And like, would anybody say, no, I don't want my baby to live? But that's like where it goes to. And still, like, the standard of a good birth is everything was okay, right? Like, we all came out okay.
Well, nobody died.
Nobody died. You know, I mean, how was your birth? Well, you know, we don't really talk about most things, but we're all okay. And like, there's no other time period in our life that's all right. Like, when you go through high school, how much time is spent on what did you study? How many essays did you write? How many college prep tests did you take in order to prepare for the next stage of your life? We don't just go through high school with no conversation, graduate, well, I made it out alive.
Yeah.
Great job. Onward. Like,
that's not a prerequisite
but that's
for
still
college.
like, like, if you ask a mom and who had trauma or who had a birth that didn't go the way that they wanted, thank God I made it to the hospital. Thank God they saved me. We're all okay. And no other questions are asked. Yet, if you look at like the aspect of any of like the primal health research or many other people, it, like we mentioned earlier, it's the most potent time. It's the time we should be asking the most questions more than any other time period in our lives, because it shapes us more than any other time period. Us as the new baby, us as the parents, us as the family, us as how we are going to raise this child in society. Like, every moment that a baby is separated from that natural experience of coming out of their mother, being with their mother, and nothing else really needs to happen 90% of the time. Like, the baby's taken away, the baby's dried off, a hat's put on the baby, the umbilical cord is cut, the baby's like hands are washed.
The mother's told when to put
no, I mean, this is after birth.
Well, yeah,
I mean, that's during
the placenta is thrown out.
The placenta is thrown out.
Yes.
The baby's put in a blanket. The mother has a shirt on because she doesn't want anybody to see her. Every single one of those teeny tiny things is fracturing that bond. It's fracturing the baby's sense of I can trust the world. And it's fracturing the mother and thus also the father or the partner's sense of I know how to take care of this baby. No, you don't. I need to take it from you. No, you don't. I need to wipe its hands off. No, you don't. And all of those things that we do, whether it's putting a hat on, wiping its hands off, cutting the cord, you know, delaying breastfeeding for some unknown reason, is going to have ripple effects on this baby's physiology for the rest of its life. Like, the immune system is established during birth. We wipe off amniotic fluid. We give the baby a bath. They've lost all of that microbiome. They've lost the amniotic fluid on their body, which helps to direct their sense of smell, which helps them breastfeed. I mean, it's just like countless the things that are set in this beautiful system to help life go on and help the families become a family and protect life, that are just fractured. Like, the word fractured is what I say the most because it feels like it works the best to describe what's going on with that.
You guys are awesome. I'm just looking at the time.
Yeah.
I want to make sure you guys get to sleep. So Andy and Eduardo, what else do you want to ask?
I have some comments, but Eduardo, go for it, man.
I mentioned the placenta because that's something I think is taboo, especially in a lot of like, even having the discussion. I have a friend who gave birth at home, and she's an older person now, and she's always tells me her experience here and having given birth in San Francisco with her midwife Beverly, who was very well known here for giving these births at home in San Francisco. And she, the first time, because I told her when I met her, I'm vegetarian, she said, "Well, you could eat a placenta then." And I said, "What do you mean? It's the only unkilled meat there is. And I thought, what?
Yeah.
And she just spoke about it matter-of-factly like that. And but no one talks about that, or people throw it out in hospital, right? Like they don't think of, I have friends who even buried it. They want to have some spiritual connection to it, but it isn't considered. It's something that's just,
yeah. I mean,
know.
the placenta is incredible. I mean, it is, and there's so much lore around it. It's our twin in a lot of cultures. It's like the thing that's holding our life throughout pregnancy. If you've heard of a lotus birth, that's the whole practice of not even cutting the cord at all, because of the energetic connection that the placenta and the umbilical cord will dry up and fall off all on their own, just like the umbilical cord stump does that's left when you do cut the cord. And there's a practice that we used to do, I still do time to time, called placenta reading, that it's actually like a reading of the whole, like the story of the baby, the story of the family. Like, it's incredible. Like, I have had the most profound experiences with people looking at their placenta and honoring the placenta. And so then there's this lore and spiritual components. I mean, if you look at, which we aren't talking about much and is way more taboo than anything we've even really touched upon, but like the nefarious aspects of our lives currently, and placentas aren't always just thrown away. The blood and the umbilical cord and the stem cells and all of those things are actually used quite often for lots of things that maybe we don't want to think that would ever happen. So there's a lot to that it's like a very precious, powerful thing that, again, has been cut from us, severed, taken away. We don't know what's going on with it. And there's like a huge movement, especially like even in hospital births at this point, for women to say, I want to take my placenta with me. There's burying, there's charring it. You can make a tincture out of it. You can make a homeopathic remedy out of it. You can dry it and take it in capsules, which is more of a Chinese medicine perspective of like replenishing hormones. You can use it to help in midwifery, to help stop a hemorrhage immediately after birth, because of the amount of hormones that are in a placenta. You can take a small piece of it and the mother can swallow it. And there's so much.
Well, they make a lot of money off of those too, which, even if you don't want to participate in any of that, like spiritual or physiological, like use of it, wouldn't it be nice for women to be compensated for the money that hospital is going to sell, and make off of that precious organ?
Mm-hmm.
Well, a few things that come to mind. First, when you talked about how the way birth and pregnancy is almost conceived of as a disease, and conceived of that way, it really just, again, this whole COVID period, this disease has been so much an excuse for control. It really just highlighted for me that, again, if you can get people to believe that this very natural process is more like a disease process, that, oh, thank God we survived, which is the outcome, everyone's healthy, then that to me just seems like that theme keeps coming up over and over again. It's to tell people this lie, a fear lie, it's around death and disease. And then if to say to a person, oh, you're not going to a doctor, aren't you afraid of dying? That's what I've been hearing about masks and vaccines. Like, you're not getting that. Aren't you afraid of dying? And yet that very thing that they're saying that I should do is actually something that's going to harm me. And it's inverted, right? So again, that's another parallel I hear in this conversation. And it also makes me wonder about things like postpartum depression. Like, what's that really about? Like, that's all supposedly something that's all women, many women have as a result of pregnancy. And I'm like, maybe there's something that's connected to this very disappointing experience about something that should have been like a living experience that was closer to something very unliving and very, very unnatural. And last, I guess I'm going to check with Brandy about whether I can share this, but I think she'll be okay, but we'll see. I'll check with her. When I first met her, we would talk about our childhoods and talk about how our childhoods affected our lives. And I would go back to 6-year-old and 8-year-old, and she would go back to her birth. And I was like, what? You would go back to a birth experience? She goes, yeah, there was really controlling things that happened during my birth experience that have affected me, like, my whole life. And I was not sure what she was talking about, but I've come to understand it more deeply. And she wasn't kidding. Like that's where she went. That's where her story started for her. Like, and she sees it as a really very thick, formative thing, in many ways negative, but something that she's been trying to make sense of and try to recover from her whole life. And I'd never heard that before. But I will say that, and this comes back to me and Brandy, the process that you described, how a woman, if she was pregnant, how she would make her way of having insight, of trying to get clear with yourself, for me was no different than the process I had to go through in deciding that me and Brandy were going to be life partners. Like that process, there were moments of insight, and there was moments of like there were times of like slow growth, and there were moments of insight where I was like, yes, and so I was very helpful for you to describe it that way, because I was like, yeah, we make decisions like this all the time, and important decisions, but they require its own gestation that isn't just linear. It has all sorts of moments where big insights, and I had weird stories that allowed me, that I saw in my dreams, that helped me understand that Brandy was going to be my partner for life, and that was necessary. Mm-hmm. So it was just this conversation has just made me think about a lot of things.
Great. Awesome. And I mean, I can touch upon a little bit more around, like, yes, we do remember our births. Maybe we can't articulate that, but there's a whole organization, like category of psychology that's perinatal psychology. It's like pre and perinatal, like health, that looks at the perinatal time, one's birth, to unravel the patterns of your life. There's a lot of research done that, for example, shows the way that someone, this is kind of, icky, but the way that someone actually may commit suicide is in direct relation to birth interventions that happened, whether it's through like medication or a substance. There was more of an increase of like medication or pharmaceuticals at their birth. If it's asphyxiation, it had to do with like breathing issues at birth. I mean, it's just wild when you start like going down like many of these things, right? Like what you don't know that's there when you start looking. And it's just it's the conversations and around all of it. And when Jay and I were talking before this, and just like what's important, what do we cover, because there's so much. And we did go to the place, which part of what you shared initially, like of how this is related to the school. And it's like supporting, I don't know the best word, but offering an opportunity or an example to be able to ask, well, what don't I know? And what choices do I have that I don't think I have, right? Like, as we're told, you can't homeschool, or, the idea around what a child should do for schooling is very much modeled in a particular way in our culture. And it's very much modeled that you don't really have a lot of choice around that. Like, you still get letters saying you have to vaccinate your kids to go to school, which is absolutely not true. And so the same thing is with birth. Like, no, you don't have to do these things that our culture says. You don't have to do what a midwife says. You don't have to do any of it. You need to find your own way. And how do we support each other in finding our own way, and into walking into these, the aspects of life that are unknown, and then the big ones that are transformative. And how do we as a species help preserve what's like sacred in that, which is necessary for humans to exist in any way, shape, or form like we've been existing. We haven't really talked much about like actually what happens in a typical hospital scenario. It's very manipulated. There's a lot of drugs that are usually used, or two in particular. And this is standard. And then there's a lot of cesarean births, right? Like in Brazil and China, cesarean births are like 50% now. And most other countries, it's about a third. But from the standpoint of like how birth has been versus how it is now, one thing that I was just recently reading that I found was fascinating. So the bones of the pelvis have different diameters depending on where you're at as a baby, or if you're removing through the pelvic bones of a woman. And those diameters in centimeters actually match up to different diameters on the head. And like we used to call it like the sacred geometry of the pelvis, because it is like perfect with an amount of centimeters that a baby's head moves through the birth I don't want to say canal ever again, the bones of the pelvis to be born. And this has been like this forever, right? Like this is the system that was designed and works. And there's the movements of labor. They call them the cardinal movements of labor, how the baby's head flexes, extends, the shoulders move, all these things. And it happens all the time. That's how we're all here, right? There's a lot to why it's like that in relation to what's important for the lungs to be squeezed, for the baby to move through this process, for the microbiome, all of that. That's one part. But the amount of cesarean sections that are now happening, and there's a lot of things, right, that are eliminated through that, which are endocrine, which are microbiome, immunology, all this stuff. But one in particular piece is now a baby's head doesn't have to go through this particular passageway anymore with these constraints or, size barriers. So we're seeing, and then you go back to this primal period where you have exponential change in human composition, whether it's physical or hormonal or anything, that babies' heads are now bigger. And there's like an increase in head size, and now there's like these conversations and thoughts around like, well, if we don't have these diameters to move through, now evolution will say our heads can keep getting bigger, which will allow bigger neocortex, aspects of our brain, which people who are, maybe considered more transhumanists actually are really excited about, because then that means our neocortex can grow bigger than it ever could before an evolution or the existence of human beings. However, larger neocortex size is related to less empathy, higher ADHD, higher autism. Like it's just, but in a transhumanistic world, those things aren't really necessary. So you get into all these like questions around like, well, what's important for humans in relation to where we're going? I have a particular perspective that probably is similar to yours, more so than somebody else who might think that our heads should get really big so we can do math problems quicker. But I don't know. Again, it's just a lot of stuff to think about and talk about that feels really important to be talking about.
I don't want to end on that scary note.
We don't have to. I mean, we can keep going, as long as like 11, that's,
No, well, I was just going to ask, because like, I mean, I have seen, maybe it's just my own bias of like the spheres I've been hanging out in, but it does seem like there is, in the past few years, especially a sort of increased resurgence or at least interest in home birth, in free birth, unassisted birth, all that kind of stuff. Partly, obviously, because of the lockdowns in a weird way. Yeah. I think there's sort of a convergence there. But I don't know. Like, I know you're not necessarily attending births right now, Jaydee, but like you have been saying, this is all so connected to what you're doing with the school, and it's connected to so many other, kind of alternative ways of thinking and ways of creating that are cropping up, I think, all over the world, really. So are you, I don't know, like, what do you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you see? Are you hopeful about kind of the future of birth? What's on your mind when you think about just kind of the current lay of the land?
I feel like I'm hopeful. I mean, I'm hopeful for the children in our school. I'm hopeful for people finding their way to what feels right and true to them, and the future of humanity, truly. And I do think that there are more options in relation to what we know what one calls free birth or unassisted birth, and I think that's fucking phenomenal. Like, I came to a place really within my midwifery, and my my third birth would be completely unassisted. My fourth, I had a dear friend who had some midwifery experience, and then my fifth, I had that same woman come back. However, I do think that how I've been promoting or speaking or like suggesting people might consider when having a baby is having a free birth and having, people there that you want to be there, that you feel the most comfortable with, and whatever that means for you. I mean,
well, it's interesting with the idea of going from home birth to unassisted birth to then free birth, and then it's really like a personal birth, because it's like it's yours, it's your, there's with the freedom, there's not rules or restrictions, because like, you know, in order for you to have an unassisted birth, you can't have XYZ.
Right. And it gets into like, well, is that really an unassisted birth? Because like you had somebody in the closet, you know, like it's I don't know, but
Well,
Your kid ran in and gave you a cookie. Like,
yeah.
And you know, another piece that we haven't really touched on that Jaydee and I have spent a lot of time talking about over the years is, you know, what the role of the father or the partners are in this situation. And you know, we with what Jaydee was doing with the matrona, a lot of what they would talk about is, you know, and I'm just going to use the term father and mother because that's our story. But like the father's role would be to, in a way,
Well, let's ask them. You know, we're gonna ask the question. Yeah.
What is the father's
No,
role?
or what? Who do you think is in charge of a birth? Like, who do you think is like in charge? If that makes sense, if I can define that, like, who would be the one to be able to say yes, no, like legally, even like.
Oh, well, the way it seems to work is the doctor now, but you just mean what we would
Yeah, I
think
mean,
it should
yeah, I
be.
mean, it's an interesting thing. I mean, some people would say the doctor, some people would say, well, the mom, of course, she's in
Yeah.
charge of.
Yeah.
Some
say
people might say
mother,
the
baby,
grandmother. What?
mother, baby, dad. I don't know,
Yeah.
but I mean, I think there's like, yeah, I'm just thinking about that idea of like holding space and
Yeah.
like what it might be a shaman like figure, like a birth attendant or someone, but I think for a lot of people, it's also their partner of like
Yeah.
somebody to protect that container so that you can go into the portal and be whatever you know, do your thing, right? So I don't go on. What were you gonna say though, Jay?
And I would just have said, if you had asked me 4 years ago or 3 years ago, I'd have said medical doctor. If you ask me now, I think I would have just said the mother.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, legally in our country, it's the father, and it has to be a male human. It cannot be a non-male human who you say is your partner. That won't work. Like if you are in a situation where, for example, a medical procedure was being like told to you that this had to happen, right? Like you have to have, let's do cesarean right now or your baby will die. The mom can't say no because the mom is still legally considered like hysterical in our country. Like even if the mom's screaming, no, 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 don't do it. She's not of right and sound mind. The grandmother can't say it. The partner can't say it. The doula can't say it. The midwife can't say it. Like the only one who legally can say that is the father still, which I mean, this could maybe changing soon,
Well,
but
it's how it's tied into
and then
the
like
law.
the spiritual component of the guardian, right, of the process. And that's where you were starting to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean you know, the legal aspect that has its own story that, you know, we know has many layers and is, you know, oftentimes very difficult to parse out what the meaning is, and you know, it's got all kinds of implications with that. But the way that we have talked about it and the way that we have arrived at is that there's this anchoring of the process that involves the father in this way, where, so you know, we have this child that is being birthed, and this child is made up of parts of the mother and parts of the father, and this child is in another, until they're birthed into this world, they're kind of in another dimension or another realm. And so the mother is the birthing, in the birthing process, is going into a altered state in which, you know, is framed as hysteria from one perspective, but is also framed, you know, from a more spiritual perspective. It's this traversing worlds essentially. And so the role of the mother is not to necessarily operate solely on this plane to the point where she would be commenting on medical procedures and, you know, details of the 3D, the mundane world. The only person that really has that connection and that insight to both the mother and the child is the father. And so they're here as an anchor, they're here as a translator, a protector. And so, like you were saying earlier, that no, you can't know more about that mother or that baby or that family's birth.
Right.
The ones that do know are the baby, the mother, and the father. And so that's really where one would need to look for the guiding principles to figure out what is needed for this transformational experience to unfold. And so that's just a piece that we have spent a lot of time talking about. It's almost like kind of its own category here, because so much of the process of birth does have to do with the baby, which is inside the mother,
And the baby, the most research that we can conclude at this point is that the baby is who initiates labor, right? Because that is this whole thing. Like, when do we go? When are we in labor? How are we in labor? Who's doing it? Can I, make it happen quicker? Is usually what people are asking it, whether it's the mom, the midwife, or a doctor, or a lawyer. But really, it's the baby. And anytime anything is done to change the process of labor, whether it's start labor, speed it up, slow it down, is working against what that baby is asking for and what that baby needs. And like I mentioned, the most common thing that we do is induce labor, even with midwives, taking castor oil, getting acupuncture, herbs, homeopathy, all of those things are ushering something. And it's everybody's journey to do what they feel is right and best for them. But to be very clear that, if you're potentially inducing something that's not yet ready to happen, the whole process is something you're going to be working against rather than with. And to what degree is, up for negotiation. But if you're starting off this, the journey of birth working against what's natural, you're most likely going to continue to have increased challenge throughout the process than if you weren't working against it, because you're trying to force something that wasn't quite ready to do it on its own in the divine way that it wanted to. I don't know how I went there, but
well, it's like
yeah.
we would listen to, in a perfect situation, we would listen to the baby.
Yeah.
And by association, that's going to involve a lot of listening to the mother, because she's close in proximity and enmeshed in a way with that baby that is. However, we do get into a realm of things that we're not used to navigating. We're navigating realms that we don't fully understand. So the next place then to look is going to be the biological father, because energetically, spiritually, biologically, all of those things, they're part of that process in a way that no one else is. And so that isn't how the father is framed. I mean, we've talked about this a lot in a lot of movies, sitcoms, mainstream culture. The father is framed as this like kind of bumbling fool that is passing out at the sight of what's happening, and incompetent. And that's also been degraded in this way, where the father isn't portrayed as this archetypal protector, archangel type figure that is primordial and powerful and beautiful and all of the things, just like the ways that the mother is dismissed. And so like the whole container has been made to be perceived as less than, when really it's this like powerhouse of transformational altered state energy that we could be. That's life changing. That's changing your life, really. Like, that's how you change someone's life, is allow them to be born in a way, or allow them to enter into this realm how they choose. Because really that's like that's one of the places that it would start. And like I said earlier, it's like it's full cycle. So we're trying to access this at where we can. And so now we're working with kids in this particular age range with the the aim, the intention, the hope that, and the understanding that this is going to have implications going forwards and backwards in, quote unquote time, and also, lineage and generational. So
I would say,
like just hearing you, the way that you're describing the baby and the mother and the father, each in their sort of most divine power. It's almost like birth was designed perfectly.
but also, and Jessica, I would like to hear you comment on this, because I feel like we've, in our differences in talking about sexism and patriarchy, I just want to say that the conversation, Jaydee and Jay, that you've entered into has really been helpful for me. So I'll do my framing, and I really would like to hear you say, Jessica, because in a sense, in a world where I believe sexism has existed and does exist, it has put the father as like this knowledgeable head, and a decider, in a sense, in that sexist world. And then in response, politically, when in thinking, no, I don't like that. I don't think that's the right thing. And I want to fight sexism. I want equality. Then I kind of led me to a world that sort of eliminated the male, and sort of tried to cut the father out, essentially, as a part. And that's why I did say, yeah, I would have said mother-child. That's kind of where I'm at right now. And I would not have put a role for the father. They could, if the woman says yes, then yes. But I really think the way you are talking about it, both you and Jaydee and Jay, feels more human than the way I've conceived of it, either in terms of sexist way or the response to sexist way. Both of them cut something out that I think is missing something about what's really going on. And so I definitely appreciate this part of the conversation. And Jessica, I'd like to hear what you think of that too, because I feel like we've touched on these areas of like, does a father or a male have a say at this point, or should they? Kind of things we've touched on that at times in our conversations.
I think I understand what you're asking. I don't think the father has a say. Like, if a woman I think the woman should be able to decide how she wants to birth. And this is an argument that comes up in a lot of couples, is like, I want a free birth, and the partner may not be okay with that decision. Like, and it's, yeah, I've had a lot of conversations with women, and it's a conversation in my own relationship. I won't go too much into that, about sort of not being fully aligned, and it's interesting to hear Jay and Jaydee talk about your, like the many conversations that you kind of had around your partnership, in terms of specifically birth and how it, how it's going to work. And that seems healthy, I think. We need more of that. But yeah, I do think a lot of the questions around sort of sexism and there's like a flattening that occurs, that like somehow the goal becomes that like we have to have the same roles, right? And like what you're describing, right? It's like, no, baby mother and father, like each has a very, very, very distinct role to play in this beautiful, magical unfolding. And I don't know. Yeah, I do think that sometimes these conversations, and then, with the whole transhumanist thing, I think different episode, maybe we'll do it at a future time, but we're also having these strange, confusing narratives kind of fed to us about now suddenly like men can give birth, and you've got surrogacy, and you've got just all of this really twisted, like transhumanist and misogynistic as well, kind of just narratives coming down the pipe, which I think it's all kind of tied into this larger transhumanist vision of maybe we'll just have artificial wombs, and we won't have to like carry this burden, and that is, I think even sort of second wave feminism, which I champion a lot on this show from various angles. I do think they kind of had a part in that framing of like birth being this horrible burden that women, have to carry. And wouldn't it be great if we could just alleviate, we'll just give them the pill for all these years so then they can enter the workforce and they won't even have to be connected to this, fertility cycle, which is such a burden. And then childbirth, right? Like how horrible and painful and dangerous, right? And that's a really twisted story that I think has been quite successfully sold over the course of the past generation or two. So yeah, I don't know. I kind of went off. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I got for now.
No, I mean, the flattening thing, I totally relate to that. That's probably the best way of describing it. But I really was curious what you made of what they were saying, because it's another unexpected journey you took in this conversation, Jay and Jaydee, and I'm really glad you did.
I do know some women who don't want their partner like in the room, like they just want to go like have their baby alone, It doesn't mean that they don't want the father to be like a part of the larger process.
The door, like that's where he's guarding the door. Leave her alone. That's what she said. Right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. A lot of different desires and possibilities.
I was just thinking about in Oaxaca, I'm from Mexico, and in Oaxaca, there's an ethno-botanical garden, and there's a center where they talk about herbs and midwifery. They have to play a crucial part. Like they can't just stand there and do nothing and just watch. They have to help with these women if they so request it, and they do these positions with them where, like, sometimes to alleviate the pain or to help in the birthing, if it's in the different positions, they have to support and be there. Like they'll sit. The woman has changed their position. I'll post pictures up on this. I remember seeing this for our viewers and listeners, and I thought I never thought, because of these are rural areas of Mexico, and I'm not from these areas, but I'm more of a city person. But I've always thought of this as strange, because in the hospital you never see a man participating that in close contact that way, other than just watching as a spectator and just filming it. I suppose that's the modern thing to do, right? So I see a difference in the way that maybe indigenous cultures might do this differently, because we're all from all continents to have different indigenous traditions that we probably have lost our way. And so I think that that's just the effect of like modern science and technology, as well as sexism, our industry, with or the authority being given to doctors more than anything. Yeah, I don't know if there is anything to touch on this subject.
I think this might be a good place to stop, unless maybe Jay and Jaydee, if there's anything you want to add, because I think we'll be coming back to this. But I think this is a good start.
Yeah, I think it's great. Good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for doing this, and thank you for sharing this stuff. Again, it's more stuff there are certain episodes we've had that twist my mind more and put me in an altered place. This is another one of those episodes.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah, it's where you find your answers. That's what we need to flex that muscle more. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, let's conclude then. I'll just do the outro and then we'll say our goodbyes.
Oh, I will tell people that for the next few weeks, I'm going to be out. So it's going to be the Eduardo Jessica show.
Oh, right.
Going to Iceland.
For 2 weeks.
I just want to let people know.
Yes. Yes.
The next few weeks will be gone. Maybe I'll send some pictures to Jessica and Eduardo, and maybe Brandy will get some video that you can post and give updates on the Iceland trip. It's part of our honeymoon. We weren't able to go before because Iceland was going to non-vax people had to basically quarantine in 2 weeks in Iceland. So we would have gone to Iceland. We were supposed to go to Iceland for our honeymoon, but we weren't going to go there and quarantine and then come home.
Home quarantine.
Right. So this is our honeymoon finally.
All right.
Great.
All right, Eduardo, this is out.
Here we go. Well, that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast / channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests in the episode notes wherever you found this episode or on our blog at whatsleftpodcast.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast / channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything you've heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our platforms on Spotify, iTunes Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, Bitchute, Odysee, YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram. And you can find our blog and any of those links in the episode notes wherever you found this episode. If you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. I'm Eduardo Barca, with co-host Jessica and Andy Lipson. Thank you both very much, Jay and Jaydee, and for your insight, your spirit, for everything that you're doing out in the world. And we hope to have you back sometime again, even to discuss any of these topics in full depth. Thank you very much for joining us.
And we'll link this school in the description, so if people want to check it out, as you guys are headed into year 3 soon, if you want to check out that, it'll be linked.
Great.
All right. Thanks. Ciao.